So welcome everyone to today's webinar. It's a tremendous honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Luca Bindi from the University of Florence. Luca is one of the world-leading scientists working in the field of mineralogy and crystallography today. He's contributed to the description of the highest number of new minerals, many of which are high-pressure phases, and is one of the top 10 researchers in the world for the number of minerals described. Luca is perhaps most well known for his work on quasicrystals and the co-discovery of the first known natural quasicrystals, work he did with Paul Steinhardt from Princeton. In fact, we were fortunate to have Paul give a talk on that discovery back in June of 2021. That was our 49th webinar in this series, and this today is our 128th webinar. And so we're very pleased to hear about the continuing developments in the study of quasicrystals, including natural quasicrystals. Luca spent virtually his entire career at the University of Florence, where he received his PhD and is now chair of mineralogy and crystallography and head of the Department of Earth Sciences. And for his groundbreaking and prodigious work, he's obviously been awarded numerous prizes and honors, including the 2015 Italian President of the Republic Prize, the 2019 membership in the National Academy of Lincei, the Italian National Academy, and the 2024 Gold Medal for Science of our National Academy of Sciences. And those are just a few of his awards. So we're so delighted that we're able to get you on our schedule. We're looking forward to your talk, Luca.
Thank you very much, Russ, for your kind introduction. And it's really a pleasure and privilege to be here today. So I'm really glad to present you the recent developments of the quasicrystals mega project. We are almost 20 years, started almost 20 years ago. But I would like to start in a very weird way, just showing you this image. Well, it is an animal, so it is a pangolin. And I'll show you because pangolin is a small armadillo, very friendly, but it is an anomaly. As you can see, it has scales like a fish, but it climbs trees. And it looks like a lizard, but it breastfeeds its babies. And it is a forest animal, but it does not run away when it sees a man. Instead, it curs into a ball. While the pangolin is the impossible for conventional classifications. And usually, when we face in front of these kind of anomalies, we can react in two different ways. On one hand, we can try to rigidify the classificatory grid to deny the anomaly and to take refuge in the conventional classifications. On the other hand, we can use the anomaly to rethink the classificatory grid and try to see the world with different eyes. So I'm going to tell you the story of quasicrystals, and I think that the beauty of the story lies in the word quasi, because I think it underlines the sense and significance of diversity. Indeed, the quasi-crystal is not a crystal they wanted to be but failed, but it has its own history, its own reality. It is just different. So I think that this is the main message of the talk today. So the importance of diversity, not of course only in mineral sciences, but of course in all the aspects of our society. Well, so having said this, I would like to say something about what quasicrystals are very quickly. So in order to show you this, I would like to show this kind of slide where I divided the crystalline materials on the left, which are called long-range periodic order materials. Yes, it is easy to individuate a unit cell which repeats in 3 dimensions. So this is the reason, of course, for the long-range order. On the right, you can see the materials which are called long-range aperiodic orders materials, which are the quasicrystals. So let's try to analyze this short sentence, long-range aperiodic order. Well, the fact that these kind of materials keep the perfect long-range order means that if you carried out an X-ray on an electron diffraction study, you can see strong and sharp diffraction peaks as the best of the crystalline materials. But the fact to be aperiodic means that you can see non-crystallographic symmetry axis. Well, I think that all of us knows what are the crystallographic symmetry axes, because if you take the example of 2 dimensions, you can easily cover a 2 dimension, for example, a floor with tiles with this kind of shape. So triangles, squares, rectangles, hexagons. Of course, these are governed by the so-called crystallographic symmetry axis. Well, if you try to cover a 2-dimensional plane without leaving gaps and cracks with pentagons, for example, you are immediately stuck because pentagons are not able to cover a 2-dimensional plane without leaving gaps and cracks. But pentagons are governed by fivefold symmetry axis. So fivefold symmetry is the forbidden symmetry in solids, of course. But of course, we live in 3 dimensions. And if you increase with the third dimensions, you got what is called the superforbidden symmetry, which is the icosahedral symmetry, which is the symmetry of a soccer ball, where you can see fivefold, threefold, and twofold symmetry axis. Well, these kind of materials, synthetic quasi-crystals, were discovered in 1984 by these guys, Dennis Sheckman, Ilan Black, Dennis Grasses, John Ken, overcooling a piece of aluminum manganese alloy and studied it by means of transmission electron microscopy. And you can see on the bottom left of this slide, the experimental proof they found. So you can see that there's kind of pentagons in the alloy they found. Well, this kind of discovery was greeted with a lot of skepticism, as you know, but I have to say that Dennis Sheckman got an incredible revenge because 30 years after its discovery, he was awarded with a Nobel Prize in Chemistry by the Royal Academy of Science of Sweden, and in 2011 with a Nobel Prize in Chemistry actually for the discovery of quasi-crystals happened 30 years before, which was just rewarding. And anyway, why these kind of materials are so important in order to deserve a Nobel Prize to the person who originally discovered them? Because as you can see from this slide, I think that the fact that the atoms in these kind of materials are quasi-periodically distributed means that, of course, you have dramatic consequence on the physical properties. And this justifies the applications of these kind of materials, for example, in non-stick paints or for fries or in substitution of Teflon because of the slippery surfaces given by these kind of materials. Or you can have applications of quasi-crystal steel razor blades, or even more important, as composite paste. I mean, mixing quasi-crystal powders with other kind of materials, you can get some composites which are useful for metallic parts, for example, aeolian winds, something like this, to something like to preserve the materials from the corrosions of the wind. So it is actually very important applications of these kind of materials, at least in Europe. Or you can have military applications, but I prefer to not discuss about this. But you can see on the bottom left the futures of this kind of material. I mean, to use the quasi-periodic order for photonic applications, because to produce photonic quasi-crystals, because these kind of materials are able to guide the light in different ways thanks to the quasi-periodicity and be very useful. So this is something like the tip of a huge iceberg of applications this kind of material could have. But of course, I'm not an engineer and I'm not so interested in applications. Of course, I'm interested in what can be found in natures about these kind of materials. And as you probably know, so let's try, since we start with the pangolin, so let's try to search our mineralogical pangolin. So our impossible for conventional classifications in nature. Well, I think that as most of you know, we discovered quasi-crystals in 2009, and the first natural quasi-crystal was found in a small piece of rock belonging to the mineralogical collection of the Natural History Museum at the University of Florence. And you can see on the slide in the top left, the small samples, which is actually just 4 millimeters in size. The other materials is just plastilene. And you can see an high resolution image on the bottom right of the slide, where you can see that we have not a metallic nugget, but it is a combination of different minerals mixed together and forming something like a small piece of rock. So one of the blackish metallic grain turned out to be a ternary aluminum copper iron alloy with these proportions. aluminum 63, copper 24, iron 13. And since we have a new compositions with a new crystal structures, we decide at that time to propose this as a new mineral to the International Mineralogical Associations with the name icosahedrite, and we got it approved, and the name reflects the internal symmetry of the mineral, which was actually pretty exciting. Well, a few years later, we demonstrate that this particular piece of rock was actually extraterrestrial in origin. And the main evidence we reported in this paper was that the presence of stishovite with inclusions of quasi-crystals. And stishovite, as you know, is the high-pressure polymer for silicon dioxide and testify a very high pressure environment of information. So this was a very important point. Also at that time to rule out the possible anthropogenic origins, because of course stishovite is not found, of course, in classic metallurgical products. And another evidence we reported at that time was that the measurement of the triple oxygen isotopes, which are reported on the bottom right, where you can see that all the data obtained on the oxygen-bearing materials coexisting with the quasi-crystals fall on the CCAM line, just indicating that, of course, they are extraterrestrial in origin. And since we have a new piece of extraterrestrial object containing a new mineral, as you have seen, icosahedrite, we decide to propose to the Meteoritical Society this meteorite as a new extraterrestrial object with the name Katirka. And so it was officially approved. So we have Katirka, the first extraterrestrial materials containing the first natural quasi-crystal, which is icosahedrite. Well, so since the success of the project, we decided to organize an expeditions in the remote area from which the Florence samples came from. And the expedition was done in the summer of 2011. It was actually an adventure in the real sense of the word. And it was an incredible adventure. And during these expeditions, we found 10 new fragments, very similar to the Florence Museum sample. And all these samples containing copper aluminum alloys. Not all the samples contained quasi-crystals, but some samples containing, of course, quasi-crystals, and all the samples containing copper aluminum alloys with the same characteristics and the same features as exactly the Florence samples. All the samples collected during the expeditions were studied by combinations of different techniques, including scanning electron microscope, electron microprobe, transmission electron microscopy, focus ion beam technique, and a lot of other techniques. And I would like to show you something we got on one of these fragments is reported here. This is one of the samples collected in the expedition, and you can see this is a transmission electron microscopy image on the top left, where you can see that we observed something like ladders. And these ladders are composed by an alternations of the high-pressure polymer of olivine. It is actually not ringwoodite here because it is iron-rich, so it is ironite. And ironite is alternated with amorphous silica, which was actually originally stishovite. So we have stishovite and ironite alternating together, all immersed in the low pressure polymer, I mean olivine, for steridic olivine. And it was interesting because we were able to obtain also the crystallographic relationship between the two polymorphs, I mean olivine and ringwoodite ironite. So since we have this kind of features, this kind of mineralogical and petrographic features observed in these TEM images made up, were symptomatic of very high pressure, very high temperature, and of course, very rapid cooling. All, I would say, corroborating the hypothesis that this kind of materials could form in an impact-induced shock occurring in outer space. This was the theory we had in 2013, and we published this hypothesis on Nature Communications. You can see here the paper. But since at that time, we were used to try to demonstrate all the evidence we got. So we tried to think it was possible to simulate an asteroidal collisions in a lab. So we decided to ask the help of Paul Asimov of the California Institute of Technology, because there they have an incredible laboratories, the Thomas Lawrence Laboratory, where there is a long gun able to accelerate a metallic projectile toward a known target. And they can simulate the asteroidal collisions, the collisions between two extraterrestrial objects. This was the motivations, and we designed an incredible experiments. And you can see on the left, on the top left, the experiments we designed with Paul. So we decided to it not as a single layer sample, but a combinations of different discs stuck it together. So we decided to select a disc of olivine with the compositions close to that observed in the Caturca meteorite, a piece of copper aluminum alloys, then a piece of natural canyon Diablo iron nickel alloy, and then a piece of commercial aluminum bronze. And everything was stuck it together, and it by the metallic projectile, because the four discs are stuck it together in the stainless steel chamber. And with our surprise, you can see that we produce some blobs here originating from the, of course, the eating of the metallic projectile. But of course, we were interested at the interface between the silicate and the copper aluminum alloys. So if you look at this metallographic image and you rotate 180 degrees and you look at the scanning electron microscopy here on the bottom left, you are at the contact between copper aluminum and the silicate. Look at the red rectangle here, because it is blown up here and then again here on the right. And with our measure surprise, at the very, very first shock, we produced an icosahedral phase with a composition almost very, very close to that of icosahedrite if you neglect the chromium and nickel content. And at the beginning, we understood that we produce an icosahedral phase by means of electron backscatter diffraction. But since I was very, very curious to see the degree of perfections, I mean, the degree of structural perfections of this icosahedral phase, I decided to extract a small grain from this tiny polished surface and collected single crystal X-ray diffraction data, because you have to know that the quasi-crystals, even if they are very, very small, they are very highly diffracting. And I'm going to show you what we got in terms of all the diffraction data collected down the five-fold symmetry axis. And the results are pretty exciting. Look at this. Look at the degree of structural perfections. Look at all the reflections follow the perfect five-fold symmetry, which is actually really, really great. So it seems impossible that a crystal a so perfect quasi-crystals can be produced in nanoseconds in a collisions, in a very, very heterogeneous collisions with several phases involved in. So it was actually a surprise. And indeed, if you're interested in more information about these kind of experiments, you can find all the evidence in this paper led by Paul Asimov and published in 2016 on Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. But in spite of all the evidence we gathered in the last years, at that time we still have skepticism of the community. And I would say that skepticism was based mainly on the fact that we were reporting alloys with metallic aluminum inside. And so you know that metallic aluminum needs so reducing conditions to form, which are actually hardly achievable. But we have another conundrum, because we have aluminum and copper together, and you know that they are completely geochemically different. Aluminum is lithophile, so strong affinity with oxygen. Copper is chalcophile, strong affinity with sulfur. How they came together. So it was actually an enigmatic problem. But anyway, what I did not like at all was the approach the skeptical guys had, because they say that because these things can happen, they didn't. So they are impossible. And when I say impossible, I'm referring to the first kind of impossible. I mean, something that would violate the fundamental laws of the universe. Well, our approach was completely different, and we thought that based on all the evidence we gathered so far, if things did happen, they can happen. I mean, they are only unlikely, so they are a wonderful example of the second kind of impossible. And I think it is the duty of all the community together to try to figure out the mechanism able to form these kind of materials. But I would say that thanks to these skeptical people, we push harder and harder, and we got an incredible amount of data able to try to decipher this kind of mechanism. And indeed, at the beginning, we thought that we could have something like an impact collisions, and then we had the vaporizations, and the oxide could be thermally dissociated to the metallic elements, and then these metallic elements could form quasi-crystals or aluminum-bearing iron-nickel alloys, and then we have something like a depositions on a copper-bearing meteorite. This was the idea at the beginning. But thanks to two recent studies, I'm referring to what we got with the ETH guys, and I'm referring to the noble gas isotopes we got on the olivine intermixed with the quasi-crystals. And the noble gas isotopes were very, very important to try to have information on the last impact of the meteorite, on the size of the parent asteroids, and other things. And more recently, the measurement of the trace elements distribution of the directly on the quasi-crystals by laser ablation, which was actually very interesting. And thanks to this kind of study, we propose a complex multi-stage scenario. I mean that all the quasi-crystals then studied by laser ablation were originally studied by transmission electron microscope, and we obtained that all the quasi-crystals contain nano inclusions, 3-5% volume percent. I'm referring to inclusions of oxides and silicates. And so the theory was that we could, based of course on the trace element distributions, we could have a high temperature condensation at the beginning, then a low temperature vapor fractionation to make the nanoparticles, and then we can have the formations of the quasi-crystals incorporating the nanoparticle, and finally the incorporation into the meteorite. It is actually a multi-stage scenario. It is actually complicated, but this was what we could offer at that time. Well, another critic we had from the skeptical guys was that, well, your meteorite is so unique. We have studied meteorites for the last 60 years, 70 years, and we never found something like this. So it is impossible because we never found aluminum-rich metals or something like this in our meteorites. Well, so I think that this critic is completely untrue because just few years after our publications, a completely independent research group headed by the British guys, Martin Suttle and other colleagues, reported a micrometeorite from the Nubian Desert in Sudan showing exotic aluminum, copper, iron alloys intermixed with silicates, exactly as in Katurka. And I would like to show you the interior of this micrometeorite reported in the paper, where you can see the large blob of copper aluminum alloys on the top of the spherula here. You can see here relic olivine, silicate glass. Look at the chemical maps, of course. And you look at this blow up here. And what is very interesting is that they carried out also electron backscatter diffraction analysis to see that the copper aluminum alloys were actually exactly what we reported in the Katurka meteorite. Well, I was able to get this very precious micrometeorite for these British guys, and together with with our research group, we carried out a new study. I mean, a focus ion beam transmission electron microscopy study to study the interface between the copper aluminum alloys and the silicates. You can see here the fib lamella we were able to collect in this some TEM study. But even more important, we were also able to collect oxygen isotopes together with the nanosims, always at the Caltech. And you can see here the craters of the nanosims and all the triple oxygen isotopes values. And what is very interesting is that the oxygen isotopes of this kind of spherula are slightly different with respect to Katurka, but of course you will see that all this data plot exactly on the CCAM line. You will see what I mean in the next slides. Well, another occurrence was last year by these Italian guys who found these alloys another micrometeorite from the south of Italy containing copper aluminum alloys. And this is another interesting point because this is a micro CT study. And look at this inside of this spherula. Of course, there are these droplets, which are usually iron nickel alloys, and all the other metals inside are copper aluminum alloys. So this is full of copper aluminum alloys. And look at the inside, look at the polished regions, the inside of this spherula, and look at the chemical maps. So it is several regions are copper and aluminum rich. And these are the compilations of scanning electron microscope image where you can see the grid contacts between the copper aluminum and the silicates. So look at the image in the middle, look at these relict olivines. And again, I would like to show you in advance the oxygen isotopes we got recently on this sample. And I would like to show you all the oxygen isotopes of all the known copper aluminum bearing extraterrestrial objects plotted together in the end. And recently, it happens in the press just 2 weeks ago on Earth and Planetary Science Letters. There's a new occurrence added by Matt Genge, which is, I think, the expert of micrometeorite. Is from the Imperial College in London, and he reported this spherule from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is a very important new occurrence because it is in a melted object, and you can see the large region, the bright regions are copper aluminum alloys, and the dark regions are silicates, and you can see they are perfectly intermixed. Would like to show you some example, and you can see at the contact, which is actually pretty impressive because you have copper aluminum alloys, chondritic silicate, and again, look at the iron droplets at the border, at the interface, and you have these kind of droplets are due to the reduction of iron in the silicate due to the presence of strong reducing conditions induced by the presence of metallic aluminum. And consequently, you have an oxidation of portions of the aluminum in the alloy to form a new generation of spinel and corundum. So this is a very important point what happens at the interface of the two different systems. And again, look at the oxygen isotopes of the Congo material. And again, they plot on the CCAM line, perfectly in the CCAM line. And what is very important is most of the materials have been characterized by nanosims and at Caltech, but you will see that all other samples, just in this case, for example, are collected in different laboratories. For example, this came from the University of Wisconsin in the United States, or you have recently characterized the oxygen isotopes of the Italian materials in France, and all the data plot exactly on the same line and very, very close each to other. So it is actually impressive. And more recently, we got an invitations. Look at the top left, together with Paul Steiner from Princeton, mentioned by Russ at the beginning. And Paul is my partner in this mega project. And we got an invitation from a very interesting guy, which is John Larson, is reported in the bottom left image. And he's very famous because he's an artist, but he is a passion for micrometeorites. He's an amateur, but he's very famous because he's searching micrometeorites in the roofs of important buildings in different cities. And so he's searching for urban micrometeorites. And it has an incredible collection of 4,000 certified micrometeorites. And so we got these kind of invitations to search for possible quasi-crystal bearing candidates in his collection. So together with Paul, we spent 2 weeks in Norway, and we searched among his collections, and we identified several possible candidates, including this one. And so these are 2 candidates which actually turned out to be not only promising, but actually containing copper aluminum alloys. And this selection was mainly based on the morphology of the materials. Look at this coriaceous nature, or for example, the presence of particular luster, or presence of metallic silvery flakes on the surface, something like this, for example, okay? And I would like to show you something about the internal structures of these kind of materials. So look at this. This is, of course, the micrometeorite on the right, which was polished. And look at the image on the right, where you can see large vesicles for large degassing. Well, look at these regions because it contains, again, copper aluminum alloys. Actually, the large spherical regions is iron nickel alloy, but all the other with irregular shapes are copper aluminum alloys. And I'm going to show you some chemical maps. Okay, look at this. So the iron nickel alloy, and in violet, the copper aluminum alloys. So we decided to study these copper aluminum alloys by the combinations of focus ion beam in transmission electron microscopy. Look at this. We selected actually two lamella, but I want to show you the results of one of these lamella because they are actually impressive. Because this is the fib lamella. Look at the bright and dark field image in the transmission electron microscopy, and you will see the chemical maps in just few seconds. But I want to show you the homogeneous region here, which started out to be a new copper aluminum alloy never described in Katurka or in the other micrometeorites. So it is the first time. And look at the chemical maps collected with a TEM. You can see here an enrichment of aluminum at the border testify the reactions we are discussing before. So the presence of an aluminum-rich oxygen-bearing phase, something like corundum or new generation of spinel at the border, and the copper aluminum alloy, the metal inside here, which is actually pretty impressive. And again, look at the new phase. This is selected area diffraction patterns of the new phase indicating a cubic symmetry. And of course, since the analogy with a synthetic counterpart, you can see here, we were able to individuate thanks to the EDS spots. And of course, this kind of informations from a structural point of view, we were able to individuate that it corresponds to this stoichiometry, aluminum 4, copper 9, which could be another new copper aluminum alloy. So look at the perfect match in this, of course, isolation image. Look at the distribution of the atoms inside the experimental image. It's impressive, the contrast. And this is something like a summary of what I show you. So for the moment, we have five occurrences of copper aluminum extraterrestrial object. So the first Katurka, then we have the Sudan spherula, then we have the Congo fragment, and then the Italian micrometeorite, and then two from Norway. So since the Katurka fragments are approximately 11, 12, so we have approximately 20 fragments from different parts of the world containing copper aluminum alloys. And what is impressive, if you look to these images, you can see exactly the same thing at the interface between the copper aluminum alloys and the silicates. So you can see that you have the metallic droplets, and then you have the new generation of spinel. I think that the image of the Katurka here is really impressive. So the formation, the strongly reducing conditions are able to reduce the iron in the silicate, and in this case, also part of the silicon to form iron silicides. And then you have a new generation of corundum and a new generation of spinel, and very impressive. At that time, we were able also to get the oxygen isotopes measurement of a new generation of spinel in the redox reactions. And again, they turned out to fall on the CCAM line, just indicating that the reaction occurred in outer space, which was actually pretty impressive. Well, so this is the image I promised you. So look at this. It is something like a summary of all the oxygen isotopes collected on all the extraterrestrial objects so far. This is unpublished data, but all fall on the CCAM line, and most of the data are actually overlapping, which is actually pretty impressive, at least for me. And well, so since we know that quasi-crystals can form in asteroidal collisions, any shockwave experiments I thought that probably I could try to search for quasi-crystals in conditions where I could have conditions, other transient conditions. I mean, in terms of pressure, temperatures, I mean, dynamical conditions, very transient states. And so my attentions moved to atomic explosions, fulgurites, I mean, materials formed by lightning strikes, and in giant impacts, okay, something like this. So for this reason, my attentions moved to the Trinity test. And of course, we know that in the morning of July 16, 1945, we got the first atomic test at the end of the Manhattan Project, close to Los Alamos in the New Mexico desert. That was the first detonations. And I have to say that it was a success in terms of science because they got an incredible detonations, probably much higher than expected, but it was a success also in terms of material science. And what I mean that during the explosions, part of the sand of the New Mexico desert was blown up in the atomic cloud and melted. But at the same time, most of the tools, the metallic tools present in the site, and also, for example, the metallic tower surrounding the bomb and the bomb itself melted as well, and of course were mixed together with the silicates, just forming what is called trinitite. Well, trinitite is very well known among geosciences, of course, when it is something like a metallic glass, and you can see that there can exist green trinitite and red trinitite. Green trinitite is mostly a silicate glass, and red trinitite is actually a silicate glass, but mostly presence of copper and from the metallic object. So, of course, I was interested in red trinitite, and I was able to collect several samples, and this is a selection of the samples I got from privates and from different institutions. And I studied several red trinitite by putting them in epoxy and polished the surface and studied the internal structure just to see the possible presence of metallic droplets or something like this. And look at this. This is a very interesting red trinitite sample. So look at the high resolution image on the left, and look at this transmitted light image where you can see here these small metallic droplets reported here. You can see the red color due to the copper, the presence of copper in the silicate glass. But these metallic droplets turned out to be very interesting because if you look at the chemical maps, look at this. This is the droplet. This is a composite maps where you can see that the silicate glass is actually a combination of the classic calcium, aluminum, silicon, something like this. But look at the blow up of the droplet. And this is important, this image, because I want to underline the importance of them and how careful you have to be. Because if you look at these kind of droplets, as it was done in the past, it seems mostly composed by copper. But if you look carefully, if you look at the chemical maps on the right, you can see that they have something like on the rim, which are copper sulfides. But if you can see this small piece of sample, which is 10 microns in size, this is a ternary alloy. It's a silicon, copper, calcium ternary alloy. And you can see the silicate appearance in the map, okay? While I was able to extract this tiny grain and carried out an X-ray single crystal diffraction study. And again, this grain turned out to be a perfect quasi-crystal, a perfect icosahedral quasi-crystal. So look at the 5-fold, the 2-fold, and the 3-fold symmetry axis. So the symmetry axis of our soccer ball. But I studied several metallic droplets inside several red trinitites. This just to be how stubborn you have to be and how careful you have to be in your experiments. And again, after the atomic test, my attentions moved to, if you want to get more information, you can find everything in this paper published on PNAS again. And so my attentions then moved to lightning strikes. And you know that lightning strikes on our planet produce very, very high temperature and produce, of course, which are called fulgurites. Well, I was interested in a very peculiar kind of fulgurites. I mean, fulgurites, lightning strikes hitting, for example, a power line. And in the power line, you know that there is the metal conductor. And then, of course, when you have, and of course, the lightning strikes melted the metal conductor, right? And then you have the power line goes down, and you have a second electrical discharge will produce a melting of the silicate. And you have the melting of the silicates and the metal conductor can mix it together. So I was interested in this very peculiar kind of artificially fulgurite, and I was able to collect it. And Matt Pasek from Florida sent his kind of samples, and it is from Sand Hills in Nebraska, and it is the classical tubular morphology of a fulgurite. But look at the right of the samples, because it contains a portions of the original metal conductor, a portions of the aluminum silicon conductors. And look at this. This is the portion of the transmitted light made of the portions where you can see the portion of the metal conductor mixed and reacting with the melted silicates. And if you compare this transmitted light image with a scanning electron microscopy image, you can see that the aluminum reacted with the silicates. Just you have the same reactions here at the border. Look at the vesicles. This is the classic degassing you can have in a fulgurite. And I was interested actually inside the metal conductor, because you have to know that all the metal conductors, the old power lines in Nebraska, contains a core of manganese, chromium, nickel alloy, which is put inside as a core to increase the electrical conductivity of the power line. So you have to know that during the melting, everything got mixed, but you have a portions of this inside a hole of the original aluminum conductor. And look at what I mean. This is a small grain inside the aluminum. This is the aluminum. It is brighter because, of course, it contains manganese and nickel and chromium. And look at the blow up on the right, and again, a blow up here, and again here. Look, it is a combination of acicular grains in a mix of another kind of matrix. Well, look at it. We were able to collect a fib lamella on this portion, and look at the chemical maps, which is actually pretty impressive because the acicular grains turned out to be enriched in chromium and the matrix in nickel. But when we carried out the diffraction of the acicular grains, it was impressive because it turned out to be a perfect dodecagonal symmetry. So we have a perfect dodecagonal quasi-crystal. Look at the high resolution image, which is actually pretty impressive, because if you try to decorate the high resolution image, you can see that it can be decorated with small white dodecagons, and thus forming a large red dodecagon, which is actually pretty impressive. And if you try to decorate with a classic motif of the dodecagonal quasi-crystals, you get something like this, which is actually incredible. And another interesting point, if you look to the larger high-resolution image, you can see that this kind of dodecagonal quasi-crystals in the fulgurites coexist with an approximant. When I say approximant, I mean a periodic object which shows similarity to the quasi-crystal. So it shows some structure features typical of quasi-crystals, but it can be still described as periodic. And indeed, if you look carefully, you can decorate with a periodic approximant most of the grain, but you can see that on the top and on the bottom, you have the perfect quasi-crystal. So exactly as it happens in the synthetic dodecagonal quasi-crystals. And again, if you want to get more information, you can find everything in this paper published again on the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. Well, finally, what about our planet? Because a lot of people ask me, well, it seems that quasi-crystals are restricted to extraterrestrial objects, but instead it is absolutely untrue. Because recently, I think that it is only if you look for quasi-crystals, you can find them. And indeed, recently, we described, together with some friends, a new mineral. And this mineral was found associated to melanite, which is important nickel telluride, quite common. And we discovered this phase, which is enriched in palladium. You can the bright grains. And so what is very interesting is that the bright phase turned out to be interesting from a structure point of view. Actually, it is periodic, so it is not a quasi-crystal, but the structure is described as an intermetallic, so nothing strange here. for the telluride of nickel and palladium. What is very strange is, and only if you have good eyes you can see it. If you plot the structures and you look at the tellurium distributions, you can see that they are distributed along a classic dodecagonal distributions. So you have a structure features typical of dodecagonal quasicrystals, but we are still periodic. So the new mineral has been approved by the International Mineral Associations with the name proxy 12-foldite, because of course it approximates a possible quasicrystals which could be named 12-foldite in analogy of icosahedrite and decagonite, the first with icosahedral symmetry and the second with, of course, the decagonal symmetry. Well, what next? I have a lot of projects in the pipeline because, of course, there are a lot of excitations and excitement about these kind of discoveries. And so I'm going to study impact glasses with several colleagues around the world. And we have a project to study lunar agglutinates because you know that most of the materials composing the regolith underwent a lot of eating of extraterrestrial bodies on the surface of the moon, and they are shocked. And I know that all these grains, grain by grain, have been studied in the past by NASA. But again, only if you look for these kind of materials, you can find them. Otherwise, you can discard if you find something from a structural point of view, for example, different from the usual. So it could be very, very interesting to find something like this also on the moon. And then again, interplanetary dust, minerals in photons, mirrors, and phase in other atomic test debris. There is a very, very important project together with the Los Alamos laboratories to start to use the possible presence of quasicrystals for nuclear forensics. But again, not to find new quasicrystals, but again, to find new quasicrystals forming systems, because nature maybe could suggest to us new materials which could be, of course, important for technological applications. Well, at the end of this project, I would like to thank all the people together with me who spent the last more than 15 years. And the first, of course, is Paul. Paul was with me from since 2007 when we started this crazy project. But today, the mega project on natural quasicrystals count more than 100 members. So this is actually rewarding. And so my suggestion, my take-home message I have for you is, of course, to look very careful to your samples and stay tuned about all the discoveries, and even more important, look for your pangolin. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luca, for a wonderful talk. This evolving story is just wonderful.
Yeah.
So the talk is now open for questions, comments. Simply unmute yourself, put your comment or question in chat.
I'm not sure if you can hear me. I have a question. That's okay.
Now go ahead, Alexander.
Yeah, so it's beautiful work, really, but I was wondering if you could comment on how this kind of quasi-crystal symmetry does that impact the electronic structure at all? I mean, because usually if you think of your classic band theory, it relies on symmetry. Are there any commonalities, or can you comment on that maybe? Might be a naive question, but
No, it is not naive at all. It is an interesting question, but of course, I'm not an expert of this kind of band structure calculations or something like this. But I know that there is difficulties, especially in ab initio calculations, because you actually don't know the real structure. So you have not atomic coordinates of the atoms. So it is actually very complicated to simulate, for example, large superstructures or something like this. So there are important groups around the world who try to make something like these kind of calculations, but they are not complete studies. So we are very far to understand the real structures, especially of icosahedral quasicrystals, which are the most complex, of course.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'll have to read up on that.
Thank you.
I had a question.
Yes, go ahead, Anmol.
Actually, similar and related, but on like the experimental side, I was wondering if there were like experiments done like to understand like the electronic properties of these materials, and if so, like what could be used? That's one question. And the other question maybe like on in general, when you study, like when you do like diffraction of quasicrystals, you said like they have like very sharp peaks, or like even like small volume can give like sharp peaks. So like, are there other like well, that is probably good feature, but are there like challenges in dealing with these quasicrystals, or like what taking for example like diffraction?
Yes, thanks for your question. Of course, I have the same answer for the electronic studies, so I'm sorry, but I cannot give you other input on this. But instead, for the diffraction studies of these kind of materials, it is actually quite complex to handle with the collected X-ray data. It is not complicated to collect data, but especially to handle because you need super space description. So descriptions in other dimensional crystallography. So this kind of reduction of data is only restricted to a small group of scientists. We usually work at the synchrotrons. And for example, recently we carried out experiments of single crystal, experiments, and it is actually really, really complicated to get the data reduction. It is not complicated, for example, if you carried out a synchrotron X-ray powder diffraction study, because for the powders, you can easily understand which are the main peaks related to the quasi-crystals. You can follow, for example, transformations at high pressure and high temperature. But if you want to make a study with details which are typical of single crystal data, it is actually very, very complicated.
See, thank you very much. Very nice talk.
Thank you.
I can imagine that the software for single crystal diffraction is not really developed for this looking at reciprocal space in this way.
Yeah. Yes, there are something like in-house software, but it is actually complicated. Yeah.
Right. Okay, Sobit, go ahead.
Yeah, great talk, Luca, and amazing work. I was super impressed with all the discoveries you have made. I wonder, all these discoveries, are these like just based on luck, or there are some set of guiding principles based on chemistry, like number of valence electrons or electronegativity of basic elements? You can look for certain type of compositions, or it is just like so far it has been mostly random.
Yes, this is a very good question, especially for the beginning of the study, because at the beginning, we were searching for possible quasi-crystals based, for example, or something like in a statistical way. So what is the X-ray powder diffraction data of the perfect quasi-crystals? Well, let's try to see all the JGPDS database in order to see some similarities with the perfect quasi-crystal. So in order to get some promising candidates, but all these attempts failed. And so we decided to search for possible composition which were similar to certify quasi-crystals in the lab. I mean, certify materials with forbidden symmetry in the lab. And for this reason, our attentions moved to copper aluminum alloys, which were originally described by some Russians. And then we found the first quasi-crystals. And then the story developed again and again. So I don't know if I answered to your question, but this is the story.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Christoph, go ahead.
Thank you, Luca, for really excellent lecture. I wonder whether there are any organic quasi-crystals. I mean, this is a problem of covering, say, surface or three-dimensional space with regular figures. And I could imagine that it should be possible to design this kind of elements which would fit one another and giving us this coverage of space. Are there any two-dimensional or three-dimensional metal-organic quasi-crystals?
Yes, thank you very much, Christoph. This is a very important question, especially just to remind that nowadays quasi-crystals are found everywhere, because just about 30 years ago, quasi-crystals were only limited to metallic alloys, and actually ternary metallic alloys, and then binary alloys, and then single elements. And nowadays we know that also quasi-crystalline materials can be found also in oxides. For example, barium titanium perovskite is able to produce dodecagonal quasi-crystals, which is actually pretty impressive. And to answer to your question, yes, because there are dodecagonal quasi-crystals, for example, made of carbon. And there are other, recently some research groups reported also quasi-crystals in proteins. So they can be really, really found everywhere. And it is actually impressive because carbon, recently some guys from Arizona studying nanodiamonds from shocked meteorites found also in regions in the transmission electron microscopy image showing five-fold symmetry. So it is actually, it seems widespread.
And the second question or comment, I think that this pair distribution function studies could be very successful in order to recover structure of quasi crystals and then say reverse Monte Carlo modeling or methods like this. What's your opinion about
Yes, it could be. As far as I know, that there is the limitation of to not know the exact positions of the atoms. Indeed, the question in the community is where are the atoms? But actually, I think the most powerful approach is to use high-resolution transmission electron microscopy if you have wonderfully synthesized specimens, for example, because you can get an idea of the distributions of the different atoms, especially if you have a strong contrast between the atomic number of the elements constituting the alloys. So this is the main approach, but of course, it is a new field in the real sense of word. So I think that a lot of things can be done.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have a question about stability. Some years ago, you brought us a sample of icosahedrite, and we studied it under high pressure and temperature and found it was stable, at least kinetically stable, over a pretty wide range of pressure and temperature. But can you comment further, more generally, about the kinetic versus thermodynamic stability of the different phases relative to, say, ordered structures on the convex hull? What are your current thoughts about that?
Well, this is the big question in the community, especially because the concept of stability is completely different from geoscientists, physicists, and chemistry. Anyway, so for example, we claimed years ago that the fact to have found the quasi-crystals in a meteorite could be a sign of stability. And the quasi-crystal community was really upset because in their opinion, you have a stable quasi-crystal, I mean, a thermodynamically stable quasi-crystal only if you synthesize in the perfect conditions, in the equilibrium conditions, not very far the situation. So anyway, just kidding. But yes, so of course, all the quasi-crystals we described in the meteorite are very, very far from equilibrium, so non-ideal conditions. So it is actually complicated to. Indeed, we are able to individuate compositions which are not. We are not able to reproduce in the lab. So these are, of course, not stable in that sense. But it is an open question, and I think that I actually believe that pressure and temperature, especially pressure, are able to stabilize the quasi-crystals in a wide range with respect to the classic stoichiometry you can see, for example, in industrials. So this is what I can say, Russ.
Yeah, great, thanks. Maybe one more, Anmol?
Hi, sorry for asking question again, but I was also wondering whether like transport properties have been measured, for example, conductivity of these quasi crystals measured, and like what does that look like, or Is there any interest on that? I was wondering.
Yes, most of the physical properties have been measured in the past, especially on the most important quasi-crystals. I'm referring to aluminum, copper, iron, or aluminum, nickel, iron alloys. And what is very interesting is that you see a completely different behavior of the conductivity, for example, in a quasi-crystal with respect to its atomic approximant. So if you have aluminum copper alloy in the proportions you have seen before, so 63, 24, 13, and you take an approximant with compositions 16, 20, 20, you see a completely different behavior. And this, of course, depends from the quasi-periodic nature of the atoms. If you want to know the reasons of this kind of difference, I don't know, but I can say you that there is an incredible difference in the physical properties of a quasi-periodic material with respect to a periodic approximant.
I see. So following up on that, like, is there gonna be, because I would imagine there could be some sort of directional dependence on the, for example, conductivity, because of this quasi-periodic nature of the crystal. Is that observed or not
It
really?
could be. It could be, and there are several papers published on the topic. So I'm sorry, but I don't want to say you something which could be wrong. So I invite you to read these kind of papers. I'm sorry, but they are actually outside my background. I'm sorry.
I see. Got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, thank you, Luca, for a beautiful talk. It took us 3 years to get you on our schedule, but it was well worth the wait. So thank you so much.
Thank you for your invitations, and thanks to all.
Okay, thank you for joining us, everyone.
Bye-bye.